Without further ado then, thank you all for your patience. We had to get here through rush hour traffic in London, so I do apologize for the slight delay in the start, but we very much appreciate you patiently waiting for us. I'm Maajid Nawaz, and joining us this evening, fresh from New York and sufficiently blown away by the history and the charm and the beauty of England is Bari Weiss.
I'm ready to move here.
Yes, absolutely.
And today, is this on?
It is.
Oh, great.
Today we're going to speak about Bari's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Outside of writing, Bari is a columnist for the New York Times and all-round wonderful and friendly person. I do suggest you get to know her in the Q&A session. For the moment, what I'll do is, to kick off the conversation, what I was thinking I'd do is go through the book briefly chapter by chapter to have Bari comment on what each chapter is about. Now, you might think that's a long and arduous task to do in 45 minutes. However, there are only 6 chapters we need to concern ourselves with because that's how long the book is. Waking Up, A Brief History, The Right, the Left, Radical Islam, and then How to Fight. So let me begin here, Bari, Waking Up. Well, that clearly indicates, I'm aware of what it indicates, but it indicates an event that perhaps shook you to your core and spurred you into action, which people here may not necessarily be aware of unless they're following anti-Semitism closely. So to what do you refer?
So the date that is emblazoned on the minds and hearts of every American, right, is 9/11. There's an additional date, I would say, for Jewish Americans, but I would even broaden that out to beyond that, and that is the date October 27, 2018. That was the morning that a white supremacist walked into the synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I became a bat mitzvah in 1997.
That's your local, that's your synagogue?
Yes. Yeah. My parents live a mile away from that building. My dad is often at one of the congregations that meets there on Saturday morning. And that man selected specifically that synagogue because of its liberal values, because it had participated the previous weekend in what was called Refugee Shabbat, celebrating the Jewish value of welcoming the stranger, right? One of the most often repeated phrases in what I call the Torah, what maybe some of you call the Old Testament, is this idea of don't oppress a stranger because you were strangers yourself in the land of Egypt. Yeah. And he said specifically, you know, the Jews are helping bring in, this is his language, not mine, the dirty Muslims, the immigrants, the black people, and the brown people. And he thought, and this is very important to understand, that in a way Jews were the greatest trick the devil had ever played. Why? Because they appear to be white, at least in America, where 85% of Jews are of Ashkenazi Eastern European descent. But in fact, they are disloyal to the white race. They are loyal instead, slavishly loyal to black people, brown people, Muslims, and immigrants. Anyway,
this was the attacker.
Yes, this was the attacker. So that morning, I was in Arizona. Like every other family I know, we have a group chat. And I got a text from my youngest sister saying, there's a shooter in Tree of Life. My thought immediately went to my dad.
Tree of Life is the synagogue.
Yeah, and thank God he wasn't there, but we knew 6 of the 11 people that were murdered. And I write this in the book, and I think it's true. I realized in the weeks and months that followed that I had sort of been on a holiday from history. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that my birthright was the following. I was born into a post-war era. I was born into an era in which the state of Israel had been reestablished. I was born into a world in which I didn't have to fight to be heard and have an equal seat at the table. Feminism had already won huge victories for me, meaning I could walk into the New York Times every day being fully myself, you know, having a partner that's a woman and wearing this Jewish star and being a Zionist and being a liberal and being a feminist, and I never had to check any of that at the door. That was my inheritance. And in a sense, I think that the Pittsburgh attack was the beginning of me seeing a shift fundamentally in perhaps the fundamental nature of America. I'll say one more thing about that. I had been raised very much of the view, and I would say this is true of many Jewish Americans, and this part is still true, that America was the singular best diaspora experience for Jews in 3,000 years of history. And that the reasons for that fundamentally had to do with the ideas that America was founded on. Religious liberty, judging people, based on their individual merit and not based on their group identity. And also the fact that the original sin of American history is not anti-Jewish violence and pogroms and genocide. It's anti-Black racism. The founders themselves saw themselves as new Israelites enacting a modern exodus. Benjamin Franklin wanted the image on the Great Seal to be of Moses crossing the Red Sea. So we really were of the view that while anti-Semitism was something we were very aware of happening in other times and certainly in other places, including Western Europe, we saw ourselves as being fundamentally inoculated from that virus. And we were wrong about that last part.
Now, you mentioned that the Pittsburgh attack was your waking up call. The next chapter it's called A Brief History. But I'm aware...
Let's do 3,000 years of history in 2 minutes.
I was about to say,
in front of the smartest students in the world.
I'm aware that's a tall order. So what we could do is combine the idea of the history of anti-Semitism with 2 chapters after that, which is, let's begin with the right. We're used to associating anti-Semitic hate coming from the right wing, and we're generally familiar with what that looks like. But you've got a chapter on it regardless. So talk to us a bit about what's in that chapter and what we didn't predict, even though we're familiar with right-wing anti-Semitism, is perhaps we didn't predict how it would also come back around again in the way that it has.
Yeah, so anti-Semitism of the far right is, without question, the most lethal form of anti-Semitism right now in the world. Now, 20 years ago, I would say, in my worst nightmare, if a person was to walk into a synagogue with a gun in America, that person would be a violent jihadist.
When you say the most lethal, are you going to, do you qualify that statement? The most lethal in the West? Because I imagine that if you're looking at anti-Semitism in the Arab world, then it would be...
Right, I'm talking about America right now.
Okay, yeah.
Fair point. I'm talking about America. If you look at just the numbers of who is carrying out the most violent assaults, those people are overwhelmingly white supremacists. And the physical fear, at least for Jews, when they think about, God forbid, an attack on a Jewish space that they're in, would be the fear of a white supremacist. Now, it's not that so I think one of the key moments for me before Pittsburgh was the Unite the Right march in Charlottesville. You guys remember that, right? It was white supremacists marching with tiki torches, polo shirts, shouting that really memorable phrase, "Jews will not replace us." Now, at first, I heard that as really straightforward. Like, the Jew is not going to take my place at the law firm, in the corner office, won't take my place at Harvard, Cambridge, whatever the case is. But in fact, it was indicative of this much more sinister, conspiratorial idea of replacement ideology. And the idea is not that the Jew is literally going to replace me, but that the Jew, using his or her proximity to power, using his or her wiles, is going to somehow pull the strings of white people in order to work on behalf of those other minority groups. And so that is what they meant. They meant literally Jews who control the US government, who control banks, who control borders. They are going to replace the authentic, real Americans with inauthentic, fake ones.
I had a call on my LBC show recently from somebody that was concealing that they're actually part of this new phenomenon online. It's the Groyper phenomenon. I don't know. Yeah. For those of you who are wondering what the hell...
It's the new alt-right.
Yeah, it's the alt-right, basically.
They're the people that are harassing Ben Shapiro when he walks down the street as being insufficiently right-wing.
Yeah. So there's a right-wing purity test they're applying. And Ben Shapiro's not right-wing enough for them. So this chap,
and he's a Jew, which they hate.
Yeah. So this chap called my show, and he was of the view that white people would become a minority in England very soon. Despite the fact that actually when I told him that 87% of Britain is still white, he felt that birth rates would mean that eventually by, I think he mentioned 2050 or some date, that eventually that 87% would turn around, and white people in Britain, in the UK, would end up as a minority. And then he very explicitly, on national radio, blamed the Jews for this happening.
Yes.
Talk to me a bit about Groypers, the online anti-Semitic far right, because I fear that they're gaining a bit of traction.
Yeah, so here's what I'll say, and when I say that I was on a holiday from history, I don't want to give you the impression that I was naive about anti-Semitism in American history. I was aware of, someone like Henry Ford, who most people celebrate as, the amazing, innovative automaker. But I grew up knowing that he also published Protocols of the Elders of Zion using his own money, that he used his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, to push the idea that the Jews were the ones who were behind World War I. It's just that, and then I could go down the line, to Pat Buchanan, to the anti-Semitism under the first Bush administration. It was always there. But the way that I think most of us thought of it is that it was increasingly being marginalized. What has changed, I would say, over the past few years is that what was once shameful and kept in a back closet or forced into a basement has now moved incredibly toward the mainstream. And you see that, there are lots of examples I could point to, but the one that I think that I've been sort of fixated on recently is that you had a White House that was giving press credentials to a right-wing news source called True News, TRU. And this is a news source that was saying that the Jews were behind the impeachment hearings. They called it a Jew coup regularly on the station. And when you have that kind of thing happening, not to mention, of course, the fact that, Steve Bannon, who proudly touted his publication Breitbart as being the platform of the alt-right, well, he was just down the hall from Donald Trump in the White House. So when, it's not hard to understand how it's moved toward the mainstream.
Yeah.
And the Groypers, by the way, they're only the latest iteration. It will be called something else in a few months.
The online space is a bit of a community where this can fester, and it's difficult to completely, as you just said, it will have a different manifestation in a few months. So in the age of post-digital revolution, in the age of unregulated internet platforms, is there any way whether it's 4chan, whether it's Reddit communities, whether it's on Facebook even, is there any way that this will be regulated? I mean, I gave the TED Global talk I gave many years ago on this point was that the internet, at the time people believed that it was a force for good, and actually it's just like the telephone. It's going to be used.
It's a neutral platform.
Yeah, and so people are finding common cause. So the isolated Groyper in Cambridge, not that I know of any here, but imagine there's a Groyper in Cambridge, suddenly realizes he's got a friend in Oxford, and then a friend in Essex, and a friend in London, and then they gather on the internet.
I mean, the difference, of course, used to be that before the internet, you actually had to make effort to go and find these extremist groups. You had to go to a KKK meeting, and by the way, there was shame around that because you had to be seen.
Yeah.
Now it's all invisible, and that, I think, the taking away of shaming in that way has been just a really, really dangerous force. But I'm not an expert on the internet. There are lots of people that make the sort of straightforward argument that these platforms are private companies, they have the right to regulate speech. I buy lots of those arguments. It's a hard line, though, because, I find myself caught between being, like you, an outspoken defender of free speech and also wanting to be able to be on the internet without getting chased around by white supremacists who, by the way, and I'm sure I know you've experienced this too, take my face and put it on their Reddit channels.
Yeah. I mean, I actually sympathize with the argument that free speech applies in the public space and these are private companies. They can set their own policies, though they do need to be consistent in those policies, but they can set their own policies for what they allow on their platforms, pretty much like a company can set what staff are allowed to get away with saying to other staff and what they're not. Do we ever get through this, though, or is it permanently here with us because of the internet? Do we permanently now have to live with bigots that will be able to gather anonymously and then go for you if you say something you don't like?
I don't think anything is permanent, and I'm an optimist. I mean, we were just talking in the car, and I say this all the time about you. The story of your own life makes me believe that no, seriously, that everything that you know, to start off one's life as a, you know, Islamic extremist and then come out the other side as one of the most powerful, strident defenders of liberal norms. Hold on, no, I know I'm embarrassing you. I know you're not allowed to compliment people in public in this country, but now I'll pivot to the answer.
We had this problem in the elevator. And
I complimented someone's coat because I thought it was beautiful, and apparently if you say someone's coat is nice, it might be interpreted as sarcasm.
It might be, not necessarily.
Anyway, I loved her coat. If you're watching this, I loved it. The relevant thing here is this.
She didn't like her complimenting her coat. And
nothing is permanent. Nothing is permanent, meaning could we, you know, am I scared that we're hurtling toward an age in which this kind of thing is normalized, in which rageful populist politics become the norm rather than civil, decent, liberal politics? Of course. But do I also think, given the span of history, that it's possible to change it? Yes, and that's why I wrote this book. That's why I'm in the business that I'm in, because I fundamentally do believe it's possible to change people's hearts and minds.
Now, this audience will be familiar with some of what we've been speaking about, right-wing Jew hate, the alt-right, and some of the hate online. People are, across the world, generally less familiar with anti-Semitism being associated with the left wing.
Do you think that's true even in a country where Jeremy Corbyn was
That's right. So I was saying, though the emergence of Corbyn has now made people realize, okay, maybe there's something to this. Can you speak a bit about left-wing anti-Semitism and what it looks like?
Sure. So I would say that, you know, right-wing anti-Semitism is blunt and explicit in its aims. It says, kill all the Jews. Okay, and you and I or anyone in this room, we don't need to have a debate about what that means. It's unequivocal. And the thing about it, even though it is, as I said, at least in the States, the most lethal threat to Jewish and minority communities right now, is that we are united in the fight against it, right? There was no one who, after the Pittsburgh attack, said, well, I'm not sure if that guy was really an anti-Semite. We were all united against it. So I think that's the one comfort, if you could say such a thing, about right-wing anti-Semitism. When it comes from the left, it is much more controversial and maybe, let's be generous, confusing to people. And that is because this kind of anti-Semitism comes smuggled into the mainstream in language that is a siren song to liberal and progressive ears. It pretends to be something that it's not. It says it's about social justice, it's about anti-racism, it's about civil rights, it's about human rights. Who doesn't want to be on the side of those things? I certainly do. And by the way, so do the majority of American Jews, 75% of whom vote for Democratic candidates. But the problem is that, you know, it's pretending to be the opposite of what it is. The other problem is the demographic. Most of us in our normal lives do not encounter white supremacists in our social circles. We just don't. We do often, though, encounter...
I do on my show.
On your show.
They call me up.
Yeah, on the street sometimes. But in general, I would imagine that you're not really at dinner parties with groypers.
That's right.
You're at dinner parties with people with PhDs who might say things like, the Israel lobby controls foreign policy in this country.
Indeed.
Right? And the thing about it, I think, is because, you know, and I'm now speaking on behalf of most American Jews who identify as liberal, it's much more socially difficult to confront it. Because when the enemy is standing over there on the other side of the street, and you're aligned with everyone in your social circle against it, it's easy. When the person is sitting across from you at a dinner table, and it's on you to kind of be the skunk at the cocktail party, it becomes much more difficult.
Have you ever heard of the idiom or the phrase, which I'm now going to paraphrase, that never has mankind committed evil as cheerfully as when doing so for God? So the basic point of that is the idea that if you think you're right and that God's on your side, or in secular terms, righteousness is with you, and that you have the moral high ground, you could commit many atrocities in the belief that actually you're exterminating evil.
Yeah,
now,
that's the history of communism.
Yeah. So can I challenge you on your perhaps not committed to view, but what you alluded to, that the right-wing form of anti-Semitism is more dangerous than the left-wing one, with the following provocation. Right-wing anti-Semitism is in your face, is not organized in the form of Her Majesty's opposition, doesn't have seats in Parliament, and generally, till today, is still not respected in society. Whereas if the form of anti-Semitism you've described is espoused by PhD holders, hijacks Her Majesty's opposition, and historically has been proven to take over entire countries and then exterminate people, does that not make it more dangerous because it's more palatable? And the last thing I'll say about this is, if you look to the rise of fascism in Europe, it was actually, so if you look to Mussolini, he was a member of the National Directorate of the Italian Socialists, and then he founded Italy's fascist party. Hitler was inspired by Mussolini, was a socialist himself, and adopted a lot of Mussolini's rhetoric. In this country, the Fascist Party of Britain was founded by a former member of the Labour cabinet, Oswald Mosley, who was a member of a Labour government, and then he founded the British Union of Fascists. He came from a left-wing perspective. Before that, I must caveat, he had also been a member of the Conservative Party. The truth is, European fascism emerged combining right-wing xenophobia with left-wing economics and populism. Mm-hmm. So in Europe, at least... That
sounds familiar to where we are headed right now.
Right now.
Well, you're making my case for me.
Yeah, those skinheads wearing jackboots and bomber jackets with shaved hair, they've never really, in Britain at least, what they haven't done is managed to take over the Conservative Party. Mm-hmm. They've always failed at that. But the Labour Party succumbed entirely to this phenomenon on the left.
Well, I make the case in my book...
Now, some of you may disagree with that, by the way, so feel free to...
I make the case in my book, and this is frankly the line that I've been most criticized by in every review and interview. I say, the threat from the left is more insidious and more existentially dangerous for exactly the reason that you say. But to be honest, at least, and this also has to do with, the insane gun culture in the United States. Most people with guns who are actually going out to kill people are not the kind of people that we're talking about. Yeah. They're, so that I think is the difference, at least in our country. Yeah. But make no mistake, I am terrified of the threat from the left, and frankly, that is the one that I've experienced the most in my life. And just to relate it to maybe where you all are in your life, I grew up in a family where my dad is a Trump-curious conservative, my mom is a liberal. We were always debating politics in my house, and I.
Hold on, so your mom didn't cancel your dad and no platform?
She withheld sex to make sure that he wouldn't vote for Donald Trump, and I'm not outing him. He wrote about it himself. He wrote in Steph Curry, which is the point guard, if you guys follow the Golden State Warriors. Anyway, what's relevant to this is that I always grew up believing that it was totally consonant to be a political progressive and a Zionist. And then all of us meeting the belief in the Jewish people's right to self-determination somewhere in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Yeah. We can get more into Israeli politics, but anyway, all of a sudden I was on a campus where I was being told by professor after professor after professor that Zionism was racism, which is the old Soviet propaganda line. And in an atmosphere of intellectual orthodoxy around that topic, meaning the entire Middle East Studies department was of that view, Zionists themselves became racist and were treated as such. And there were incidents when I was a student, like things like a professor saying to a young woman, "You're not a real Semite because you have green eyes." Or I don't. No. She said it to another student. I have very dark eyes. But saying to another student, "Get out of my classroom if you deny the atrocities of Jenin," things of that nature. Meaning, so that's where I started to be told by professors that it was impossible to both be a political progressive in good standing and believe in a fundamental part of my, and most Jews, Jewish identity. And that really started me off, frankly, on my writing career, was writing about that topic.
Talk to me a bit about anti-Semitism coming from the third element here in your book, which is, you call it radical Islam. And is there a relationship between that phenomenon and the left-wing anti-Semitism?
Yeah, well, the left-wing view, if we're going to just do it in totally broad brush terms, is that there's something justifiable about, let's call it jihadist violence, that it's a sort of rational reaction to the evils of, Western imperialism.
Yeah.
And that is where they start to sort of unify.
Yeah.
To be honest, I really hope to avoid writing the chapter on radical Islam in this book, because as you well know, touching that topic in any way, even in, I think, I hope, a sober and fair way, makes you a target, which actually proves the point of why it's so important to write about it. And what I say is this, look, there's no question that the most anti-Semitic countries in the world right now are countries like Egypt, like Syria, like Lebanon, countries that frankly have no Jews at all. There's 20 Jews left in all of Egypt, maybe less at this point. Just one in Afghanistan. I mean, Egypt was once the seat of Jewish civilization.
Yeah.
So, I don't know where you want me to go with this. I could talk a lot about it.
So I would like you to, there's a hand up over there, Gabriel, are you?
No, it was a 5 minute.
Oh.
Aha, yes, so it's 20 to 7 though. Are you?
That clock is quite profoundly.
That's, that's what I was looking at. What is the time? Which clock should I be looking at? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll pull out my phone and rely on that instead. Right, it's 7:02. Yeah. Okay, that says it's 20 to 7. I thought we had lots of time. Yeah, it's good. Right, so let's talk about that now. Let's get to the following statement that I'd like you to explain. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
Why?
Do you agree?
I agree. I've had entire debates on this, but I'm not so sure everyone else would or even understand the statement. First, let's start with this. What does Zionism mean?
Well,
and then
let me go one step back,
Sure.
which is like to define what anti-Semitism is, which we sort of haven't done. Anti-Semitism functions differently than racism, although it can be similar. It can be similar in the sense of someone not wanting their child to marry a Jew, or not wanting a Jew in their club, or not wanting a Jew to move in next door. That is anti-Jewish racism. But what anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It is an ever-morphing conspiracy theory in which Jews, and I'll get to where Israel fits in a minute, because it functions sort of as the Jew among the nations, in which Jews play whatever a given civilization defines as its most detestable qualities. So that is how under Soviet communism, the Jews are the arch capitalists. How under Nazism, they're the race contaminators. How, in the view of the far right, they are the betrayers of the white race and of white civilization, even though there is no such thing. And how today, on the far left, the Jews are the handmaidens of oppression. They are the defenders of the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East. They are handmaidens, actually, of white supremacy, right? Because the things that are the most evil and detestable on the left are all of those things. What is Zionism? I wish we had a lot longer to talk about this, but it's very simple what Zionism is, although the word itself, beginning in, under the Soviet Union, there's a incredible propaganda campaign that we're still sort of enjoying the poison fruits of. But what Zionism is the Jewish right to self-determination, the same right as any other people. And I will say, I think it's important for those of you who don't know my work, I'm a strong critic of Israeli government policy. My Zionism leads me to oppose the occupation and believe that there needs to be an independent state for Palestinians.
So the Israeli state is not the Israeli government?
Correct.
Zionism is the Israeli state's existence, a bit like Egypt exists.
It's in
and Jordan exists.
Right. It's in the same way that I'm critical of lots of American governmental policies. I don't think we should have children in cages right now, which we do in America. But that doesn't lead me to make the argument that America itself should be dismantled, right? India occupies Kashmir right now. Morocco occupies the Western Sahara. And yet you don't see any, China occupies Tibet, and Russia occupies Crimea. You don't see any mass movement calling for the dismantling of the state. And I'll say one last thing. Anti-Zionism, to be an anti-Zionist, let's say in the late 1800s in Eastern Europe, where all of these ideas were being debated, right? Anti-Semitism's on the rise. Everyone's thinking about how to solve the Jewish question, as they called it. And there were all kinds of answers to it. Some had answers like the Bundessocialists, the answer of assimilation. Some had arguments, of turning more toward Judaism. The Zionists made their argument. I don't think that to be an anti-Zionist in that context is immoral. It was, Israel didn't exist. But there is a moral difference between being an anti-Zionist.
Nor did many other nation states at the time.
Sure.
That's the key point there.
Yes, and I think that there's just a world of moral difference between being an anti-Zionist in 1920s Poland and being one today. The analogy that I use in the book, and I hope it's instructive, is that there is a conversation to be had between a couple before they choose to have a child. Can we afford the child? Is there room in the apartment? But once the child is born, that conversation becomes moot. And what anti-Zionism means, practically, is the erasure, the dismantling, I don't know what you want to call it, of the largest Jewish community in the entire world, the vast majority of whom are Jews of color.
Which nobody argues for Pakistan, which was also created in 1947 as a homeland for Muslims.